I smelled the copper first, sharp and raw at the back of my tongue, as if I had bitten down on a live wire. The barracks air was always sour, recycled breath, sweat trapped in blankets, disinfectant too thin to hide the rot. But this morning it seemed thicker, cloying, like blood already half clotted. My hands trembled as I tried to lace my boots, though I told myself it was only the cold. Somewhere down the corridor a Vox speaker clicked, and a hymn began, flat and metallic, the words smearing against the rusted walls until they were less prayer than static. They said we were the Emperor's shield, but the only thing we shielded was the ledger, the tally sheet of names, oaths, and debts that weighed on us heavier than any lasgun. We were guardsmen of the 908th line, though no one remembered where the regiment had first been raised. Our colors were faded, our insignia rubbed nearly to nothing by oil and sweat. What mattered was that we marched when the order came, and we bled when commanded. Oaths bound us tighter than the leather straps of our kit. Oaths, we were told, could never be broken. The barracks itself was a cavern of stonecrete and rusted rebar, lumen globes buzzing overhead with a dying light that always seemed a half-second from guttering out. The walls sweated with condensation, feeding the stink of mold that no incense could cleanse. Each morning began the same, boots stomping in rhythm, a chorus of coughs and curses, the scrape of mess tins, the commissar's voice reciting catechism through the vox, daring anyone to falter in their response. We were not allowed to own much: 2 uniforms, 1 bedroll, 1 lasgun, 1 knife, but we were allowed oaths. Too many of them, sworn to the Emperor, sworn to the regiment, sworn to the throne, to the commissariat, to the general, to the shrine relic locked in the corner of our hall. Each oath was another chain. I used to think myself proud of them once. I told myself the chains were honor, that the weight meant worth. My father had been a sump worker, his lungs rotted out by promethium fumes before he reached 40. He had died unmarked, unremembered, his name scrubbed from the rolls when his tithes went unpaid. I thought the guard would give me something he never had: permanence, a name written in ledgers of stone. I thought an oath would be a kind of shield against being forgotten. But oaths corrode faster than iron left in the sump. That morning the wrongness was small, almost laughable, though it curdled in my gut like bad rations. A crack in the wall by my bunk had widened overnight. Stonecrete dust lay on my blanket like frost. I traced the fissure with a finger and found it warm, as though the barracks itself had a fever. No one else seemed to notice. They were too busy pulling on flak jackets, cursing at jammed buckles, sharing stolen gulps of recaf brewed thin enough to see through. But the line of warmth beneath my hand lingered. It was like touching a pulse. The wall throbbed once, faint but undeniable. The day's drills blurred together. Parade ground, endless gray, boots striking cracked cement in monotonous thunder. The sergeants shouted the words we had all memorized. Discipline is salvation. Hesitation is death. The Emperor watches, the Aquila sees. The catechism always came in threes, like hammer blows to the skull. I mouthed the words but felt them curdle in my mouth, like repeating a lie long enough you start to choke on it. It should have ended there. Another drill, another day, another weary collapse into a bunk beneath a buzzing lumen globe. But in the mess hall, the wrongness deepened. The corpse-starch stew reeked faintly of oil, slick rainbows swirling across its surface. I forced it down anyway, because hunger was worse, and because not eating was suspect. Men had vanished for less. It was during the evening hymn that the crack in the wall widened again. A thin line from floor to ceiling, black in the lumen light. And in that crack, for the barest instant, I thought I saw an eye. Not human, not animal, just an opening that saw me back. I blinked and it was gone. But the copper taste returned, stronger, and I knew I had already failed. You see, every guardsman knows the catechism about oaths. An oath is a fortress. An oath is a shield. Break one, and you are less than human meat to be burned, husk to be discarded. The commissar's sermons made that truth iron. but no one told us how easy it was to break one, how simply failing to believe while you mouthed the words was already enough. That night, as I lay staring at the fissured wall, the taste of blood metal in my mouth, I felt the first chain snap inside me. It made no noise. The barracks hummed with snores and murmurs, with the faint squeal of rats in the vents. Outside, the shrine smoke clung to the streets, rising in coils that looked like prayers half forgotten. My hand rested on my lasgun. My lips whispered the catechism, but my mind wandered, doubted, cracked. And that was it, Hat was the oath broken. Small, invisible, a thought no louder than a breath. But in the Imperium, the smallest fracture is enough to damn a man forever. The oath was broken, though none could see it. Not yet. At dawn, the klaxon ripped through our skulls like a serrated blade. The air was wet with condensation dripping from lumen cages, each drop falling in rhythm like a clock counting down. We were herded to the parade square, breath steaming in the chill, boots slick with frost that stank of rust. Commissar Rel stood upon the dais, cloak stiff as sheet iron, his rebreather hissing with each sermon breath. His voice, amplified by the vox horns, scraped along our spines like a file. Brothers, sisters, you are not your own. You are the Emperor's flesh. You are the Emperor's debt, and debt must be paid in blood. We answered in chorus, voices ragged, the words drilled into us until they were muscle memory. The Emperor protects. But I said it without the weight of belief. My tongue moved, my throat rasped. Inside, I was silent. And in that silence, I knew something had already been written against me. The commissariat had ways of knowing. They always did. That day's drills turned harsher. Not the usual marksmanship tests or discipline marches, but oath recital under duress. We were ordered to run in full kit, breath burning, sweat running, while screaming catechisms until our voices cracked raw. Each stumble, each hesitation was noted by the scribes hunched in shadow with their slates. Rel's gaze never moved from us, twin green lenses fixed on our souls. When my voice faltered, just once, just a syllable lost beneath the pounding in my ears, his head cocked like a carrion bird scenting meat. He said nothing. Not then, but his silence was worse than any reprimand. We were dismissed into the mess hall after dark. The ration stew was colder than usual, the lumps of protein reconstitute floating like drowned things. Around me, men muttered half-jokes, insults, anything to smother the dread that hung on us like mildew. Oath drills meant someone had failed. Oath drills meant suspicion. And suspicion meant the shadow of the bolt pistol. Corvin sat across from me, his face scarred with the pale lines of Law's burns. He had been my bunkmate for 2 years, steady as iron. He leaned close, eyes narrowing. "You faltered," he whispered. My spoon froze halfway to my mouth. "What?" "During the creed, 3rd line, I heard you choke it." The mess clatter drowned my heartbeat. I forced a laugh, thin as paper. Running in full kit, lungs freezing, any man would stumble. Corvin didn't smile. He touched the aquila hanging from his neck, a scrap of tin polished to a shine. Careful, the aquila sees. That night, as I lay staring at the fissure in the barracks wall, I wondered if Corvin would report me. A single whispered word to the commissar was enough. Men disappeared that way. Not dragged screaming, but called into a side room, a signature on a parchment, a gunshot muffled by hymns. The bunk empty at dawn, the name erased from rolls. Oath breaker, always the same word, spat like phlegm. The days lengthened into gray sameness, but the drills grew crueler. Endurance trials under frozen rain, bayonet practice until our arms shook, the hymns louder longer until words blurred into noise, and through it all the feeling of eyes, not just Commissar Rel S. The wall fissure by my bunk widened another finger's breadth, black seam pulsing faintly. Sometimes, when the barracks fell silent at night, I swore I could hear a whisper from it. Not language, but pressure, as if the stone itself wanted me to confess. The bureaucracy closed in like a cage. New parchments appeared daily, declarations, signatures, affirmations. Each guardsman had to write his oath by hand 10 times, then press his thumb blood upon the page. Each guardsman had to recite under auspex scans, the machines humming with green light as they measured tremors in our voices. When the quill touched my hand, I felt the falseness burn. Each letter scrawled was a betrayal. My blood pressed into parchment felt thinner, more watery, as if it knew I was lying. They brought in a preacher one evening, robes reeking of incense and mildew. He spoke of purity, of the danger of thought, of how a doubt could rot a man faster than any plague. His sermon was a litany of paradox. To question is treason, to think is heresy, to feel is weakness. We knelt on stone until our knees bled through fatigues, repeating after him until voices broke. When we returned to the barracks, 3 bunks were empty. No one spoke their names. To speak them was to be infected. I began to notice things, or perhaps I only imagined them. Either way, they gnawed at me like rats in the walls, the commissarial scribes dipping their quills into ink that shimmered too bright, the preacher's shadow stretching too long behind him, twitching in rhythm not his own. Corvin's muttering prayers in his bunk at night, words too fast, as if racing something that pursued him in dreams. And always the fisher, wider now, thumb-thick, breathing faintly in the dark. On the 5th day of oath drills, they made us kneel in the mud courtyard, hands bound, while Rel walked among us. His boots left no imprint in the muck. He stopped before each man, asked a single question. Would you die for the Emperor? Each answered yes, voice breaking or strong, it mattered not. Only the word mattered. When my turn came, the copper taste filled my mouth again. I felt my tongue hesitate, the word catch in my throat. Yes, I forced out. But inside, the silence screamed louder than the answer. Rel's green lenses lingered on me for a heartbeat too long. He moved on. That night I carved at the fissure with the tip of my bayonet. The stone flaked away easily, as if rotten. Behind it was darkness deeper than shadow. For a heartbeat I thought I heard my own voice echo back, whispering the same word I had spoken on the parade ground. Yes, only the tone was wrong, hungry, mocking. I shoved the stone back into place and swore I would never touch it again. But the oath was already broken, not once but twice. The commissariat would come soon. I could feel it in the way the sergeant's eyes slid over me during drill, the way Corvin no longer sat across from me in the mess. I had become marked, though no parchment bore my name. Marked in the ledger of suspicion, where the ink is invisible until it burns through your skin. Every guardsman fears battle. Every guardsman fears death. But worse than both is the bureaucracy, the slow tightening of signatures and sermons until you are crushed without ever drawing a blade. The Imperium does not need your blood on the battlefield to kill you. It needs only your silence. The summons came on the 7th day, and I had already given it. I woke to the hiss of the lumen globe above my bunk flickering on, too early, too sharp. The others were still asleep, or pretended to be. Boots scraped stone. A scribe stood in the doorway, robes damp with condensation, data slate glowing in his thin hands. He did not speak my name. He only read the number stitched into my flak jacket. 736. My body moved before thought did. Habit drilled deeper than marrow. I rose, boots sliding into place, hands fumbling for belt and tags. The fissure in the wall gaped behind me, a black grin. I felt it watching as I followed the scribe into the corridor. The barracks doors shut with a clang that felt like judgment. We walked through narrow halls lit by lumen strips buzzing at irregular intervals. The air reeked of incense and old oil, a smell I had come to recognize as the perfume of punishment. Every so often we passed statues of saints, their stone eyes gouged hollow by centuries of devotion. In their hands were relics, swords, scrolls, chains, all pointing down, as if toward the guilty. The scribe led me to a chamber I had never entered. Its ceiling was low, its walls damp, the stones sweating like flesh. A single lumen globe swung overhead, casting shadows that leapt like bayonets. In the center stood a chair of iron, straps cracked with age but slick with recent oil. Commissar Rel was waiting. His rebreather hissed, lenses gleaming emerald in the half-light. The pistol at his side was not drawn, but its weight pressed on me harder than any muzzle. 736, he said. His voice was metallic, flat, but threaded with something worse than anger, disappointment. You faltered. My mouth went dry. I did not, Commissar. His head tilted, the rebreather hissed like laughter. Your oath wavered. The Emperor heard, the Emperor sees, and the ledger does not forget. I said nothing, because what could words repair once they had already broken? He gestured, and the scribe pressed a slate into my hands. A parchment flickered across its surface, lines of catechism written in blood ink. At the bottom was space for a signature. Sign it, Rel said. Renew your oath, redeem the fracture. I read the words. Each line was a chain, each clause a nail driven deeper. They bound not only my body, but thought itself. To speak was loyalty, to doubt was treason, to exist was debt. I felt the copper taste fill my mouth again. If I signed, I would live. I knew that much. They would release me back to the ranks, perhaps watched more closely, perhaps with harsher drills, but I would live. And yet the quill trembled in my hand, because to sign was to swear again, to swear knowing the oath was already ash in my chest, to pretend belief where only silence remained. That was the first tightening of the noose. The paradox coiled around me. Only by lying could I survive, and yet each lie was another oath broken. I pressed the quill down. The blood ink hissed as it drank from the parchment. My hand scrawled my name, jagged, ugly, traitor script. The scribe took the slate back without a word. Rel's lenses lingered on me a moment longer. Then he leaned close, rebreather whirring, his voice a whisper like steel dragged over bone. You live, guardsman, but know this, what you swore today will burn you later. Oaths are not forgiven. Oaths are remembered. He dismissed me with a flick of his hand. The chair behind him seemed to breathe in the shadows. I did not want to know what had been strapped there before me. When I returned to the barracks, Corvin was waiting on my bunk. His eyes searched mine, hard as flint. What did he ask? I lied, drill correction, a warning. Corvin nodded once, but I saw the tension in his jaw. He knew. They all knew. Oaths leave a stink when broken. A man can wash himself in incense and machine oil, but the rot seeps through. The next days blurred, drills, hymns, rations, but the air had changed. Men stopped speaking to me in the mess. No one shared recaf from their tins. In the yard, my name was called last, my rank spoken slower, as if each syllable might shatter. I was still one of them, but less than them. A shadow. And still the fissure grew. One night, unable to sleep, I pressed my ear to the crack. A hum throbbed there, low and steady, like the beating of a machine heart. Then, faint, unmistakable, a voice. My voice. It whispered the word I had signed. My name. The syllables dragged slow, as though spoken underwater. I jerked back, bile rising. My bunkmates shifted in their sleep, restless. Corvin muttered a prayer, too fast, too desperate, and I wondered if he too heard whispers in the walls, if every man's fissure was different. On the 10th day, 3 men were taken. They had failed the oath recital. I watched as Commissar Rel walked them into the courtyard. No sermon this time, no chance to sign parchment, just 3 muffled shots, hymns blasting over vox to hide the sound. When we returned to barracks, our bunks were already stripped, tags gone, names scratched from the rolls. Oath breakers, that was the word whispered in the mess. No one dared to speak it near me, but the silence that circled me was worse. A week later, the campaign began. Orders came through the Vox, embarkation at dawn, frontlines by dusk. The world's name meant nothing, just another rock in a galaxy of graves. We packed kit, shouldered lasguns, filed into transports. The air stank of promethium and sweat. As the transport rumbled through the underhive tunnels, lumen strips flashing past like dying stars, I realized what awaited me. Oath breakers were not always shot. Sometimes they were sent forward, names unspoken, bodies marked for sacrifice. The guard had many ways of cleansing dishonor. One was the bolt pistol, another was the battlefield. I pressed my forehead against the cold steel of the transport wall. The fissure was far behind, but I felt it with me, gnawing at the back of my skull. The oath was broken, and the ledger was written. The only question left was how long the Emperor's patience lasted. The front smelled worse than the demanded payment, worse even than the sump tunnels I'd grown up in. Promethium smoke clung to the trenches like a second skin, mixing with the stink of rusted iron, wet stone, and the sour-sweet reek of blood left too long in the cold. We were herded into firing lines along shattered earthworks, the sky above burning orange with artillery fire that never paused, not for breath, not for prayer. Our orders were simple as always: hold, not advance, not retreat, not think. Hold until the Vox crackled otherwise. So we held, knees deep in mud that stank of corpses, rifles pressed against sandbags that bled rainwater, eyes straining at the horizon where only ruin moved. Every so often, a shape would crest the smoke and we would fire, not knowing if we struck man, beast, or machine. It didn't matter. The Emperor demanded trigger fingers more than he demanded certainty. The Commissar was with us, he always was. Rel stood at the lip of the trench, cloak stiff with rain and ash, rebreather hissing like a metronome that measured loyalty in seconds. He did not fire his pistol, he did not need to. His weapon was our fear. At intervals, he would walk among us, voice booming through the voxcaster strapped to his chest, reminding us of the oath. You are not men, you are not women, you are promises made flesh, and promises do not falter. Each time he said it, I felt the fissure in me widen, as though the crack in the barracks wall had lodged itself inside my chest, because I knew I had already faltered. I had already signed the parchment with a hand that shook, knowing every word was hollow, and still I lived. Still, I stood among them. Each heartbeat was survival purchased at the cost of another broken oath. The first push came at dawn on the 4th day. Shapes in the fog, too many, too fast. The sergeant screamed to fire, and we did, Law's bolts carving red lines through the mist, burning silhouettes into things that kept coming. Men fell beside me, their skulls opening like fruit under return fire, their screams drowned by Himvox static blaring overhead. I fired too, hands numb, eyes watering, teeth clenched against the copper taste that filled my mouth each time I squeezed the trigger. The enemy pressed harder, closer, until it was flesh against flesh, bayonets tangling in wet bodies, and then I saw Corvin. His lasgun was empty, his blade broken, his hand pressed to his belly where blood poured in rivers. He staggered toward me, eyes wide with the panic of a man who has seconds left to live. "Help me," he gasped, voice raw, more plea than command. My hands moved before thought did. I grabbed him, dragged him behind a sandbag, pressed my palm to the wound. He looked at me, lips trembling, and whispered the oath. The same words we had spoken 1,000 times. His voice cracked at the 3rd line. I should have finished it for him. I should have carried the words on my tongue, given him comfort in death, honored his chain with mine. That was the oath, that was the creed, but I couldn't. The words curdled in my throat like poison. I held him as he died, silent, my lips refusing to shape the catechism. He died staring at me, and I knew he saw it, the absence, the betrayal. His last breath was disbelief, not relief. In that instant, my survival was bought at the cost of his soul. What saved me was not the Emperor's shield, but silence. Silence that damned us both. The push broke, we held. The trench was a charnel house, the mud drinking greedily of flesh and blood. The wounded moaned, the dead lay twisted, the smoke carried hymns louder than screams. Commissar Rell walked among us, lenses gleaming, pistol still holstered. He nodded once as if satisfied that the oath had held. And I laughed, a raw sound muffled behind clenched teeth, because it had not. I had lived, yes, dragged my body through the charge, fired my rifle, obeyed the order. But I had broken the oath again, and this time with witness. Corvin's eyes were still on me in memory, wide and accusing, even as his body lay cooling at my feet. I had failed him, failed the regiment, failed the Emperor, and yet I breathed. The paradox tightened like a noose. Each moment of survival was another betrayal. The longer I lived, the more damned I became. That night I sat in the mud trench while the others cleaned rifles and muttered prayers, and I pressed my bayonet into the fissure inside me. Not flesh, but spirit. I thought of driving it through, ending both the silence and the paradox. But when I lifted the blade to my chest, my hands shook so badly I could not push. Cowardice saved me. Cowardice damned me further. Above, the sky burned with shell fire, each explosion like a hymn sung in iron. The mud breathed, the trench whispered, and I knew I was already less than human. An oath-broken guardsman, marked, waiting for ledger and pistol, but still alive, still holding. And in the Imperium, that is the most terrible fate of all. It never does. They moved us like pieces across a board whose shape we never saw, only the squares under our boots. From the trench to the ruins of a manufactorum, from the manufactorum to a blasted shrine complex, from shrine to ash fields where no plant had grown in centuries. Always forward, always deeper into places that smelled of burned oil and old blood. Sometimes we marched for days under skies that glowed red with warp lightning. Sometimes we rode in armored carriers that shook with every shell strike, but always the hymns came with us, always the catechisms, always the oaths repeated like nails hammered into bone. And with each repetition, the fissure inside me widened. The silence that had saved me once, twice, 3 times, had become a hunger of its own, a whispering void where prayers went to die. Yet still I walked, still I fired, still I obeyed. I was both loyal and damned, a paradox in flak armor, carried by the machine of war because it did not care if my soul had already slipped. In moments of stolen quiet, when the artillery paused and only the wind moved through ruins, I felt the weight of the wider war pressing down. The sector itself seemed infected. Supply lines stuttered, rations came spoiled or crawling with sumpworms, Vox signals faltered as if choked by unseen hands. Rumors spread that whole regiments had been lost to storms in the void, their ships torn apart not by enemy fire, but by currents of the warp that twisted metal like wax. Pilgrims spoke of shrine worlds falling silent, their reliquaries abandoned, their saints' bones left unguarded. Even the stars overhead seemed dimmer, as though the astronomican's light flickered uncertain. And always the whispers, cult uprisings in hive levels, tithe fleets vanishing, strange plagues that left the body intact but hollowed the mind. We told ourselves they were lies, fear spread to weaken morale. But I had seen enough to know truth, and lie wore the same mask. The galaxy itself was cracking, and I carried a smaller crack inside my chest, a mirror of the great wound spreading across the Imperium. Once in a ruined hab block where we bivouacked, I found a mural half buried in ash. The paint was faded but clear enough, A double-headed aquila, wings spread across stars, each feather a world, each talon gripping chains of gold. Above it, words in high Gothic etched by a hand long dead. We are his oath. I stared at that wall until my eyes burned, until the letters blurred, until I saw only chains upon chains, wings that smothered instead of shielded. My squad mates prayed at the mural, knelt, and pressed their brows to the crumbling plaster. I could not. My silence was louder than their voices. In that moment I understood. The Imperium itself was an oath, sworn 10,000 years ago and broken 1,000 times since. Yet it endured not through truth, but through the machinery of repetition, through blood and silence. My own damnation was only a smaller echo of what the galaxy itself had already become. The commanders spoke of victories, of worlds secured, of heretics purged. But victories felt like ash. We would march into a city of 1,000,000 souls, and by the time we left, only rubble and silence remained. The ledgers marked it as reclaimed, a triumph of faith. But I remembered the faces, the starving children herded into shrines, the conscripts trembling as they swore oaths they could not keep. Sometimes we fought against enemies too twisted to be human, things that bled smoke and screamed with many mouths. Sometimes we fought men who looked like us, prayed like us, begged like us. The difference was paper-thin, written in ink on some distant administratum slate. Oath keepers, oath breakers, it hardly mattered. All were reduced to corpses in the mud, to names scrubbed from rolls, to silence. And I, who had already broken my oath in the smallest of ways, felt kinship with them all. In their deaths, I saw my own reflection. There were nights when I could not sleep, when the stars burned too bright above ruined walls, and I wondered what the Astronomicon looked like from here. They said it was a light that pierced all darkness, the Emperor's gaze stretching across the void, guiding ships through the madness of the warp. But to me, it was only another eye in the fissure, watching, unblinking, demanding. If billions of souls were sacrificed to keep it alight, then every guardsman's oath was just a smaller sacrifice, a smaller burning. What was one guardsman's silence compared to 1,000 lives consumed in a single day? The scale made a mockery of guilt, yet the guilt did not lessen. If anything, it deepened, for I saw my crime magnified into the great crime of the Imperium itself. Survival through damnation, life through betrayal. What saved us always destroyed us. Once, during a lull between campaigns, I stood watch on the edge of a bombed manufactorum, the night wind carrying dust and the faint thrum of distant artillery. For the first time in months, I saw the sky clear. Stars wheeled overhead, countless, cold, eternal, and I felt very small, a speck beneath a galaxy burning with wars I would never see. But in that smallness there was also truth. I was nothing, my oath less than dust, my survival less than a whisper. And yet the machine demanded it. The Imperium stretched across those stars only because men like me swallowed silence, signed lies, broke oaths, and kept walking. The paradox was not mine alone, it was the creed of the entire species. And in that knowledge, dread curdled into something worse, acceptance. If the Imperium itself was oath-broken yet still endured, then so too would I not forgiven. The end came not in a blaze of artillery, but endured. Not in the crush of a massed charge, but in the quiet of an order whispered down the chain. We had been holding the ruins of a shrine for 3 weeks, walls pockmarked by shells, the air thick with the sweet rot of incense burned too long. Our numbers had thinned by half, yet the commissar stood unyielding, lenses green and eternal, pistol never drawn but always present. When the Vox crackled that night, static spitting around words I could barely make out, I knew by the sudden stillness in the trench that it was not another exhortation to hold. It was an order. Final, absolute. The kind of order that binds the soul as surely as any chain. We were to advance at dawn, not with support, not with armor, not with hope. We were to advance alone, across open ground, against an enemy whose numbers we could only guess. The men received it with silence. No groans, no curses, just the sound of hands cleaning rifles, tightening straps, murmuring prayers. I did the same, though my fingers trembled as I pressed fresh cells into my last gun, the copper taste thick as bile. I told myself it was only another march, another battle, another chance to die. But the fissure inside me whispered louder. It knew this was different. This was not survival balanced on the knife edge of faith. This was an execution written as an order. To advance at dawn was to sign our own death warrant, to write our blood into the ledger willingly. And I, already oath-broken, could not accept it. I had given silence, I had given lies, I had even given my comrades' final breath unanswered. But I could not give myself into the maw of certain death simply because a voice on a vox demanded it. So I broke the oath a final time, irreversible, not in silence this time, but in action. While the squad slept in mud and him static, I crept from the trench, last gun slung, bayonet sheathed. My boots found the cracked stones of the shrine floor, my hand pressed to the wall where saints once stood painted. The fissure was there too, a crack running from altar to roof, black as ink, pulsing faintly with the rhythm I had carried since the barracks. I pressed my forehead to it. For the first time I prayed, not to the Emperor, not to the Aquila, but to the darkness itself. I prayed for escape, for survival, for anything but the dawn charge that waited to tear me open, and the wall whispered back, not words, not comfort, but acceptance. It opened like a wound, and I stepped through. What I entered was no place I had ever seen. Not the trench, not the shrine, not the galaxy of rust and stone I had always known. It was a corridor of black stone, walls glistening like flesh, lumen globes swinging on chains though no wind moved. Voices murmured from the walls, my voice, Corvin's voice, the commissar's voice, all repeating oaths in broken tones, all failing in the same silence. I walked deeper, each step heavy, each breath sour with incense and rot. At the corridor's end stood a throne. Not golden, not sanctified, but iron, rusted, and slick with blood. Upon it sat no one. Yet I felt its weight pressing on me, demanding what the Emperor's throne demanded, sacrifice. The only difference was honesty. Here there was no pretense of protection, no promise of salvation. Only the truth that an oath was always a chain, and chains were meant to break. I knew what I had to do. To sit in that chair was to seal my fate, to bind myself not to the Emperor's ledger, but to something older, darker, truer. It was an oath of betrayal, a vow to silence itself. I lowered myself onto the iron seat. The metal bit into me like teeth, straps coiling of their own accord, needles piercing skin, drinking deep. Pain flared, then dulled into warmth, into a sickly calm. The voices in the walls ceased their murmurs and began to sing. My name was lost in the chorus, dissolved into the sound of 1,000 oath-breakers who had come before. I was one of them now. Not guardsman, not soldier, not servant of the Emperor. An oath broken, bound to something else, something that fed on the fracture of promises and grew fat on silence. At dawn, the charge began. My regiment went forward without me, their boots pounding mud, their rifles blazing futile fire across open ground. Commissar Rel led them, cloak whipping, pistol raised high. From the shadows of the shrine, I watched them vanish into smoke, watched the enemy guns cut them down, watched the earth drink their blood. I did not move to follow. I sat in my iron throne, unseen, untouched, my oath already spent. For the first time since I had signed that cursed parchment, I felt peace. Terrible, hollow peace. Survival bought not by faith, not by courage, but by betrayal so deep it could never be undone. And that was the act that sealed me. I had chosen silence over oath, survival over comrades, the fissure over the light. There was no return, no absolution, no redemption. I was oath-broken, not in secret but in truth, the Imperium would forget me, erase me from rolls, grind my name into dust. But the fissure would not. It would remember. The shrine would whisper my silence forever. I do not know how many days passed. Time inside the fissure was not measured by lumen globes or the rise of suns, but by the rhythm of blood dripping on stone. When I emerged at last, the trenches were empty, the manufactorum ruins silent but for crows fattened on corpses. The regiment was gone, slain, scattered, erased. No banners remained, no hymns. Only the rusted helmets half buried in mud, the tags stripped by scavengers, the stink of promethium fires burning long after their purpose was spent. I walked among the dead as one already dead myself, invisible, unseen. If the commissar survived, I never found him. Perhaps he fell with the others, pistol still raised, eyes green with faith that could not save him. Perhaps he marches still, a phantom bound to his creed. It no longer mattered. My oath had been broken long before his. I wandered for days, though it felt like lifetimes. Through cratered cities where statues of saints toppled into gutters, their stone faces worn smooth by acid rain. Through forests of ash where only twisted iron grew. Through sump marshes where the water bubbled with chemical breath, reflecting a sky that burned too bright with warp light. Everywhere I went, I carried the silence inside me, and everywhere the fissure followed. Sometimes in walls, sometimes in the earth, sometimes only in the corner of my vision. Always black, always pulsing. It whispered not words but hunger, the kind of hunger that is patient, eternal, waiting for all things to crack. And I knew then that I was not the first oath broken. I was only another added to a choir that stretched back across centuries, each voice swallowed into silence until no creed, no hymn, no prayer could drown it. The galaxy pressed in. News trickled like oil through the Vox units of scattered survivors, whole sectors lost to warp storms, pilgrim fleets vanishing in the void, hive worlds torn open by rebellion and plague. The astronomican flickered, they said, its light dimmed. The navigators screamed in their towers, blind to the currents of the warp. Yet still the catechisms flowed from every shrine, still the administratum scribes inked their ledgers, still the commissars raised their pistols. Oaths upon oaths, chains upon chains, all breaking faster than they could be remade. And I, a single guardsman, oath broken in a trench, was no different than the Imperium itself. My silence was its silence. My fracture was its fracture. The scale shifted, widened, revealed truth too vast for hymns to bury. We were all already lost, and the machine endured only because it refused to admit it. There were moments in the ruined nights when I thought I felt the Emperor's gaze touch me. Not the blazing sun of catechism's promise, but something older, colder. A fragment of consciousness stretched thin across a galaxy, bleeding itself dry. It touched me like a hand pressing on a wound, not to heal, but to remind me the cut was there. And in that touch, I understood the paradox at last. The Imperium demanded oaths it knew could not be kept. It demanded faith it knew would break. It fed on that breaking, turned silence into fuel, fracture into endurance. The oath itself was never meant to be whole. It was meant to fail, so that men like me would keep crawling forward, guilty, damned, but alive. The Emperor did not need my belief. He needed my betrayal, and I had given it freely. I stopped searching for comrades. I stopped searching for orders. I walked until my boots rotted and my flak jacket peeled apart, until my rifle was more rust than steel. I became a ghost in battlefields no longer mapped, sleeping in ruins where saints wept rust from their stone eyes, drinking from puddles that tasted of metal and oil. Sometimes I saw patrols of fresh regiments, bright banners and clean lasguns, their voices raised in hymns I once knew by heart. I never approached. I never joined. To them I was already erased, oath broken, a stain scrubbed from the rolls. If they saw me at all, they looked through me, as if my silence bent the air around me until I was only shadow. Now I write these words on scraps of parchment torn from dead scribes, scratched with the point of my bayonet dipped in my own blood. Not for absolution, not for confession, but for memory. Because the Imperium will forget me. It must. To remember an oath-broken guardsman is to admit the creed was false, and that it cannot do. But the fisher will remember. The silence will hold my name long after the last hymn fades, long after the last commissar's pistol clicks empty. Perhaps one day another guardsman will find these pages and see himself in the lines. Perhaps he too will taste copper in his mouth and know the truth. The oath is already broken, and what saves us always destroys us. And so I end where I began, with the taste of copper on my tongue, sharp and raw, as though I had bitten down on a live wire. The barracks air is gone, the hymns are gone, the regimen. Tea is gone, but the taste remains, thick and cloying, the flavor of silence, of oaths fractured beyond repair. It fills my mouth still as I write the last line. I thought once that an oath was a shield. Now I know better. An oath is a fissure. And in the end, all fissures widen.